So in this tutorial we will learn about object-oriented programming. So uh, before that I will just explain you what is procedural programming. So object-oriented programming is an advancement to the procedural programming. So at this point we know we have covered the topics structures, then functions, and we have also covered data types. So I will just write data members. We know that data members are nothing but variables. So to explain the difference between procedural programming and object-oriented programming, I will take a simple example, a real-life example of a car. So a car can be considered of as an object. So we have covered the topic structures. So structures, if we will define a struct car, if we will define a structure car, we can just write the properties, or you can say the variables that represent the properties of this structure. So we know that if we want to create a structure, we will use a struct variable and we will just write it like this. So what are the properties of car? We can say that the car must be having some color, which I will represent using integer variable, or you can even use anything, but here I'm just focusing on the properties of the car. So the next property can be the speed, and similarly there can be a lot of properties of a car. So a real life object has some properties. So if we take some other example, like if we take an example of orange or an apple, we know that it is an object and it has some properties, like it has its color and some taste, some shape. So every object around us has some properties. So in procedural programming, we have covered structures, functions, and basically in procedural programming we are just concerned with the properties of the objects. You can see that in procedural programming we use structures which represents the properties of the car, or you can say the physical properties of the car. But in real life we know that this car does not only have physical properties, it also has some behavior. Like this car can move, and this car can move with some speed, some velocity. So this car has physical properties as well as behavior. But in procedural programming we were just using structures which are using properties only. So in procedural programming we were just concerned with the properties of this object, and it was represented using a structure. So in object-oriented programming, what we are concerned with properties and behavior as well. So The procedural programming is implemented in the C language, and in the C++ language, object-oriented programming was introduced, and C++ is also known as C with classes. So in object-oriented programming, we will just use properties and behavior as well. So behavior is an additional thing. So properties can be represented using some variables, but from now on we will not call them variables. We will call them data members. So an object has some properties which we will represent using data members similar to the structures. But in object-oriented programming, the object also has some behavior, and this behavior can be represented using functions. And these functions are known as member functions. That means that we can include data members plus functions also in a structure, but structures does not allow member functions. So a new concept known as classes was introduced in C++ to implement this. So if you want to create a structure with data members as well as member functions, you will not use structure, you will use classes. To use classes, we have a separate dedicated tutorial, classes and objects. We have a separate tutorial, but at this point we will just discuss about what a class is. We are not going to go in depth. So a class can be represented using a class keyword. It is a reserved keyword, and then the name of the class. This time the name is car, and this car has some properties. So I will represent it like this. So the car has some properties. Let's suppose the car has color. It also has some speed or etc. So these properties are known as data members. You can just write int speed, int color, and these are the properties. And in the classes, since we can also include the behavior of the object, we can also include functions in this class. For example, we know that a car can move, so we can create a function move here. So we can create a function move, and there are a lot of functions that a car can do which can be included in the class. So this is behavior. Since real life objects have properties and behavior, so this object-oriented approach is much familiar with the real life concept. But in the procedural programming, we were just using the properties of an object. We are not including the behavior also. But in object-oriented programming, we have also included the behavior. So I will explain a difference between them using a diagram. So in procedural programming, there are functions. Let's suppose this is one function and this is another function, and these functions operate on some data. And these data are nothing but the variables. So these functions can operate on data. So in procedural programming, the functions will work on some data. In object-oriented programming, or you can say OOPS programming. The short form is OOPS, so you can also, we will use OOP, object oriented programming, from now on. So in object oriented programming, we are not going to separate functions and data. Now we're going to create a single part, or you can say a single module, in which we are going to create an object, and this object has its own functions and properties as well. So we can create some more objects which have different functions and properties. So an object is an instance of a class. Object is instance of a class. So if you are creating a class, you can see that you can create an object of this class. Just like we were creating structure variables in the structure, we can create objects of this class. And different objects have the same structure. That means that they have the same class, because this time we are also including the behavior. So the objects belong to the same class. Let's say this is object 1, comma object 2, and so on. We can even create an array of objects, which we will cover in a separate tutorial, and we will implement classes which are a part of which implements object-oriented programming. But in this tutorial, my main objective is to explain you how objects are created and how object-oriented programming is better than the procedural programming. In the next tutorial, or you can say in the next part of object-oriented programming, we will discuss some concepts known as OOPS concepts. And in OOPS concept, we will discuss how object-oriented programming provides some more features to our programming language, and in that way our code will become more efficient and it will look more clear to the programmer or anyone else. So basically, object-oriented programming is just properties plus behavior, which is just encapsulated in a single object, and these objects can share data also. So this is just the basics of object-oriented programming. So we will move on to the next part. So thanks for watching.